Everybody, and welcome to a very special support meeting. We've got some folks joining us from different areas of Southwestern Ontario. So I just wanted to start off by introducing myself as well as our guests. So for everybody who hasn't met me, my name's Devin. I'm a medical student here at Western University in London. And I'm also the lead facilitator for the Elgin Middlesex London Parkinson's support group. So normally I would just be facilitating discussions for people in my region, but as you can tell, today is a little bit special. So thank you for everyone for joining us. I want to start off with a little bit of background. So in our January support meeting, we had a great discussion, and we had some folks that were interested in learning a little bit more about the class action lawsuit that was circulated. So I won't get into the details because that's why we have our guests here today to discuss that. But in short, there was a chemical that was used as an herbicide that was found to be linked to Parkinson's. And our guests are the ones responsible for bringing a class action lawsuit forward to seek compensation for those that may have been affected by this chemical. So I'll introduce our guests in a minute, but before I do that, I just want to give Mandy or Shelley just a chance to say anything on behalf of the Parkinson's Society before we get going. Any disclaimers or anything to add?
So we are recording this session so that we're able to share it with more clients who couldn't make it today. If you have a question, if you could just either raise your hand or you can submit it to Devin through the chat at the bottom of your screen, and he can ask it on your behalf. We want to thank the members of Siskinds for joining us today. This is really exciting, and we appreciate your time in discussing the lawsuit.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you so much. So one last thing would just be the structure. So we want to make that accessible to everybody. So again, everything's going to be recorded as Mandy has alluded to. And then, yeah, if that changes, whether you want your camera on, just be aware of that. We do have 2 hours allotted for today, so that should give us plenty of time should we need it. So we'll give our guests the floor to begin with. They can give us some information, but we do want this to be a dialogue. So if you have any questions, we want to have a little bit of a Q&A session at the latter end of the meeting. And then as well, if you don't feel comfortable at any point, you have a question, message Mandy or I, and we can ask questions on your behalf as well too. So without further ado, today we're joined by Eileen, Daniel, and Tyler, who are representatives of the Siskinds law firm. And they're working on this particular case. And they've graciously come on today to talk with us about the case. As Mandy has already said, thank you so much for joining us. The Parkinson community is always eager to learn more and to be advocates for themselves and their loved ones. So I think this will bring a lot of value to a lot of people. So I'll give you the floor to introduce yourselves and share what you brought with you today.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Devin, and thank you to Mandy at the Parkinson's Society for Southwestern Ontario for inviting us here today to speak about this. My name is Eileen Mandarich, and as Devin mentioned, I work for a law firm called Siskinds, which is headquartered in London, Ontario. I'm also joined by my two experienced colleagues here, Tyler Planetta and Daniel Bach. And as Devin mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the lawsuits and fill you in on some of the public information we can share about the case. I'll also mention that we're working with our affiliate in Quebec called Siskinds. We've quite a team of lawyers here. So you just have the three of us today, but if you have further questions that we can't answer today, we welcome you to contact us. And if you want service in French, we can put you in touch with someone who speaks French, and we're happy to answer any questions later on that we don't get to today. So I'll also note that if you see me looking away from the camera, it's so that I can look at my screen off to the side here, so I can feel like I'm looking at you. But I'm sure everyone here is used to that by now. So maybe in the future, we'll have in-person events again, but I'm happy we have this virtual event. And that it's recorded because it means that we can potentially get more people in the room and eventually reach the people who are not in the room today, which is a good thing. So by way of an introduction, I've been part of the team of lawyers working on the Paraquat and gramoxone lawsuits in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia since August 2021. And this lawsuit is pretty significant because we're dealing with products that were sold across the country for a very long time, since the 1960s, and which we're arguing are connected to Parkinson's disease. So I'm happy to start a conversation about this with you today, and of course speak with any of you afterwards or later on to further discuss any questions or issues you might have. But today I'll start with a broad overview of the case, and then I think I'm going to talk about 4 more specific things. So first, I'll tell you a little bit more about the precise products we're suing about. As Devin mentioned, they're products containing the chemical paraquat. Then I'll give you some more background on what a class action is and how it works, because I think a lot of people have heard the term, but might not necessarily know what it means. Then I'll get into a little more detail about where we are in the case right now, procedurally speaking. And then I'll cover a few points about how we're building our case. I think the general gist of it here is just that we're looking to share what we know with people who care about this issue, and we're looking to connect with the community as much as possible so that we can hear what you have to say and make sure that as we're advancing this lawsuit, we're keeping people informed and that we understand how best to reach out and understand the impact and make sure we're working towards a successful class action that moves us closer to what we all want here, which is accountability where that's appropriate. I'm also going to note that I'll be talking about allegations we're making in the lawsuit today. So whenever that comes up, you might hear me say, this is our claim, or this is our allegation. And that's just a reminder that the case is still in its early stages. And while we have some evidence we think supports certain conclusions, we don't have a court decision. So until then, we'll have to keep talking about our claims and our allegations, or the studies we think support certain conclusions, using that kind of language just to acknowledge that that question isn't in front of the courts yet. I'm also going to note that I can only talk about public information today. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can, but if we run into questions that go deep into our litigation strategy or deep into the evidence and ask for conclusions about what it means for how the case is going to turn out, I'm not going to be able to answer those, and I'll just let you know if we get there in the questions. So let's start with a high-level look at the case. This is a case about herbicides, weed killers containing the active ingredient paraquat, which is sometimes sold under the brand name gramoxone. This stuff has been available in Canada since the 1960s and is used in a wide variety of agricultural and landscaping environments all over the country, including here in Ontario, obviously. We're suing on behalf of people who developed Parkinson's disease after being exposed to products containing paraquat as the active ingredient. So the class actions primarily cover anyone in Canada who was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease after using or being exposed to gramoxone since July 1st, 1963. These are the plaintiffs or the class members in the litigation. So if you think that you might be in the class, we'd be happy to talk to you. And I believe our contact information, I've mentioned contacting us multiple times. I believe that our contact information was already shared on the Parkinson's Society Southwestern Ontario website. I can drop it into the chat if anyone thinks that would be helpful, but I'm gonna try to refrain from saying over and over again for you to contact us, because I think that if you are interested, you'll find a way to do so. And I'd be happy to drop that in the chat later if that is useful. So now I'll move on to the defendants we're suing. We're suing a Swiss-based company called Syngenta AG and 3 of its affiliates, who we say are responsible for making these products and marketing them in Canada. These are the defendants in the lawsuits. When I say defendants or Syngenta, these are who I'm talking about. It's the people we're suing. So the goal for us in this case is to get compensation for people who were exposed to the defendant's products containing paraquat and then developed Parkinson's disease as a result. And the main issue for the courts will eventually be whether the defendants violated their legal obligations by manufacturing a product that can cause Parkinson's disease and then misrepresenting their paraquat products as being safer than they actually are. So I use the word eventually there because the case is still, as I said, in its very early stages. And we have a long way to go before these core issues in the case actually end up before the courts. And I'm going to talk a bit more about why that is after I talk a little bit more about paraquat itself and why we're suing about it. So that is something I will get to. But first, let's talk about the products at the heart of the lawsuit. And I'm going to take this moment to specify the products we're concerned about. So we want to make it a little easier for you to know what to expect just by going over what it is and how it's used and what we're claiming about it. So this is about paraquat specifically that has been sold as a weed killer in Canada. And the reason why we're focusing on paraquat that was sold in Canada anytime after July 1st, 1963, is because that's when paraquat was first registered for sale in Canada. And the paraquat products we're most concerned about have been sold under the brand names Gramoxone and Paraquat Technical in particular. So that's also why you might see the lawsuits referred to as the Paraquat/Gramoxone litigation. It's all about the same chemical, paraquat, but includes products sold under the brand name Gramoxone. And they're all herbicides. So paraquat products have been used to kill weeds and grasses in a lot of different agricultural settings. So this is in orchards, with vegetables, with plantation crops, in pasture land, in nurseries for ornamental trees, and also in professional landscaping situations and other maintenance of outdoor areas type of situations. So there are a lot of these kinds of products that have been sold since the 1960s, and those have been used in a lot of different places. And they come in a lot of different formats. So they've been sold previously as a liquid, as granules to be diluted with water, as an aerosol, and it comes in these different formats because it has been applied in a lot of different ways. So that's using field sprayers, by truck or tractor, using just watering cans or garden sprayers, and also through crop duster planes. Our claim in the lawsuit is that anyone who was involved with preparing or handling or applying paraquat, or even people who are working in an agricultural setting while paraquat is being applied, could have been exposed, either by inhaling it or through contact with bare skin, or even swallowing very small amounts. We're especially concerned about people who've been using paraquat products on a yearly basis, just applying it to farmland, for instance, every year, or people who are flaggers for crop duster planes, or who were directly in fields working while it was being applied. So just working day to day with these products, mixing and loading where there could be spills, cleaning out spray equipment or containers, unclogging spray nozzles and valves on the spraying equipment. All of these kinds of jobs provide a lot of opportunities for potential exposure in agricultural and outdoor environments. Now, I'm not in the agricultural business myself, and I've never worked on a farm, unfortunately. So these are just some of the examples of how exposure could happen. And as I mentioned, we're happy to talk to anyone who remembers using paraquat and handling it, especially if that was on that day-to-day regular basis as part of your work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the epidemiological studies as well that show that it is fairly well known at this point that people handling paraquat in an occupational setting can actually end up exposed to the point where it's in their it has a risk of entering the bloodstream. So that's a little bit about paraquat and how someone might end up exposed to it. So I think the next logical question is, what happens when there is an exposure? So we have studies that we think show 4 things. The first one are the roots and mechanics of exposure. Pardon me. The second is how paraquat is toxic and the mechanics of how it behaves in the body. The third thing is just a strong basis that animals exposed to paraquat develop Parkinson's symptoms. And then fourth, that paraquat exposure increases the risk of Parkinson's disease in humans. So since the 1980s, we have seen a lot of studies come out on the connection between Parkinson's disease and paraquat, or about the mechanics of how it behaves in the body, both with animal studies and with epidemiological data. And I'm not going to go through a literature review today, but I'll give you some of the information we have about exposure and why we think there's a connection between paraquat and Parkinson's disease that's worth litigating. So in front of the court, just a point here, paraquat studies alone aren't going to get us to a judgment. We're going to be getting expert reports from specialists who understand the science and can tell us, or rather tell the court, what it all means and what conclusions they can draw from it for legal purposes. So I'm going to speak about all this in very general terms. And if people are curious about these studies, I have sent a package to Devin Box, and I can actually check back with my team about what else we can provide to you out of the public facing information that we've looked at. So I'll start with the routes of exposure. There are studies showing that paraquat can enter the bloodstream when you inhale it, when you swallow it, or even when you touch it with your bare skin. So we know that as far back as the 1980s, there were studies about paraquat exposure in agricultural settings specifically. So we actually have a 1981 study by people who worked for one of Syngenta's predecessor companies, which shows a pretty early understanding that people who are applying paraquat in their day-to-day work can be exposed to the point where paraquat residues appear in their urine. And this is important because if it's in the urine, that would tend to suggest that it was in the bloodstream. So that's as far back as the early 80s. Later on in Quebec, there was a study published in 1987 connecting herbicide use to Parkinson's disease and referencing paraquat as a potential cause. Once we know as well that once it enters the bloodstream, there are further studies showing that it can enter the brain, either by crossing the blood-brain barrier or getting in through the nasal passages, the olfactory bulb, or other parts of the brain not protected by the blood-brain barrier. And then once it's in the brain, we've seen research showing that paraquat can stay in the brain, including in the regions of the brain relevant to the development of Parkinson's disease, where it has been shown to specifically target the dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra pars compacta. And this is not a science lecture. Those are the neurons which we know are susceptible to starting the kind of neurodegeneration doctors associate with Parkinson's disease. So there have been further studies on this up to the 2010s and the present day, with conclusions to the effect that chronically inhaling or ingesting or chronically absorbing paraquat through your bare skin can cause people to absorb low levels of paraquat into the body, which don't immediately cause the kinds of acute effects that are warned about on the label, generally lung or liver pathologies, but can cause other harmful effects over a lifetime of cumulative exposure. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about what we know about toxicity. So paraquat is known to be highly toxic. It's known to be an effective herbicide, and unfortunately, the features that make it a good herbicide are also what makes it toxic to humans in a number of ways. Specifically, it can be acutely toxic, so it can cause immediate damage in certain quantities, and it can be latently toxic at lower levels of chronic exposure. So in both cases, the toxicity comes from the fact that paraquat is very good at causing oxidative stress. I'm not going to get into the biochemistry here. Devin would know more about that than I do. But oxidative stress can cause cells in the body to degenerate and eventually die. Paraquat reacts with the oxygen that's supposed to be in the cells of living organisms and creates chemically reactive oxygen derivatives that can interfere with the functioning of the cells and cause that degeneration and cell death. And the important part here is that paraquat doesn't just react with the body once and then disappear. It actually cycles through that harmful chemical reaction over and over again in the body. So if you see scientific literature that refers to the redox properties of paraquat and redox cycling, that's what that refers to. The long and short of it is that paraquat can cause damage over a long period of time by going through a huge number of these redox cycles and that's a special characteristic it has, which makes it very effective as a herbicide, and also what makes it really effective as a toxic substance for humans. Paraquat has been in the news for being very acutely toxic. This is well known. It's supposed to kill plants, and reports have come out that swallowing even a capful of it can be fatal to humans. And the thing is, I can tell you all that not just because there has been media exposure, but because that information has been added to the label. The manufacturers know that it's acutely poisonous. And I can say that because it is there right on the label and in the material safety data sheets for Paraquat products. That way, people know what's going to happen if they have an acute exposure. If they spill it onto their skin or get some in their mucous membranes or swallow it or anything like that, they know what kind of risk they're taking because they can see it on the label. And I won't get into too much detail here, but part of the grounds for our lawsuit is that the label, the material safety data sheets don't include a warning about the risk of Parkinson's disease. And that's what we're worried about for the purposes of our claim in the lawsuit. For us, it's less about the acute exposure that might immediately cause lung damage or liver damage, and more about the cumulative exposure and the latent effects of that kind of exposure over a long period of time. And as I mentioned, there's a strong case for Paraquat's role in causing Parkinson's symptoms in animals. So scientific studies have found an association between Parkinson's disease and Paraquat exposure in animals and in humans. But Paraquat is actually sometimes used in scientific studies to artificially cause Parkinson's symptoms in animals when they want to study how Parkinson's disease works, is what we've heard. The studies show that Paraquat gets into the brains of lab mice, and that when it does, studies have found that a lot of the Parkinson's disease related proteins, in particular alpha-synuclein, are present, and they saw the same kind of neurodegeneration, the brain damage that comes from the changes within the cells that are hallmarks of Parkinson's. So that brings us to the human epidemiology. The Paraquat Parkinson's Association is well studied in animals, and that's important because there are obviously ethical issues with conducting the same kinds of experiments in human subjects. But there have been other studies in the US and in Taiwan and other places which have looked at the association between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease in humans. Since the 2010s in the US, we've seen meta-analyses looking back on the earlier smaller studies and also finding that Paraquat use plays a role in human Parkinson's disease. And I think another key point here to refer back to is the latency period. So a lot of the time, people might have used Paraquat for a number of years, for a period 10 to 20 years ago, and are just seeing symptoms now and just getting their diagnosis now. So I think that's also an important factor to consider when thinking about human epidemiology and sort of the idea that this chemical can stay in the brain for a long period of time and cause a lot of damage over a long period of time. And our claim in the lawsuit is that with exposure, there's the risk that Paraquat can enter the bloodstream, get carried into the brain, and then begin causing damage that many years down the line can lead to a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. So I'm sure that everyone here at this meeting is familiar with Parkinson's disease and what the symptoms look like. You might also know the generally accepted science on Parkinson's disease, which is that environmental factors play a role in over 90% of cases, as opposed to genetic factors alone. You might have also heard that one of the characteristics of Parkinson's is the death of dopaminergic neurons in the brain, and that these neurons are very sensitive to oxidative stress. And that's something that makes them very susceptible to the effects of Paraquat once it gets into the brain. Once enough of those dopamine-producing neurons die, dopamine production in the brain gets lower and can eventually fall to the level where a doctor would actually see motor symptoms that are the beginning of Parkinson's disease. And as I mentioned, this is something that can take a lot of time. So that's a pretty broad view of the information we have at this stage. And what's going to happen later on in the lawsuit is that we're going to get an expert to review all this science and review all the studies and help the court understand what conclusions it can draw about all of that. But I can talk a bit more about that process later. I think the evidence we have from these public-facing studies is well covered here, and it leads us to conclude that we would have a case in this instance. I also want to talk a little bit about the regulatory restrictions. So given that paraquat is so toxic, it makes sense that Canada might have put some regulatory restrictions on it, including changing how it needs to be labeled. And this has happened, and this has changed over time. So in Canada, right now, and since the 90s, Health Canada's Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency, which I'm just going to call PEMRA, is responsible for herbicide registration and for testing the health and environmental risks of registered herbicides. And paraquat has been around since the 1960s. So that's much before our current version of that agency existed at all. But in 2015, the PEMRA looked back and reevaluated the risks associated with paraquat and decided to classify gramoxone as a restricted class product due to paraquat's toxicity and the chances of accidental exposure. This changed the type of permit required to spray it, the labeling requirements, and the type of protection required to use it. And despite these changes in 2015, our allegation is that there was no change to what the company was saying about the product, to the material data safety sheet for gramoxone, or anything like that to account for any connection between paraquat and Parkinson's disease, despite the direction that the science was going. So our claim in the lawsuit, which I'll get deeper into in a bit, is about this idea that the defendants had reason to warn consumers and members of the public about the risk of Parkinson's disease associated with paraquat. And the PEMRA actually more recently indicated that it would go back and again reevaluate paraquat sometime in the years 2021 to 2022. And that's something we're still waiting for. So that's not the end of the story for the Canadian regulator either. But that might give you just a little bit of an overview of how it might have come to be that that the product was so widely available for so long. And this is all important because, as I mentioned, without the labeling, you can't really know what precautions you need to take to avoid Parkinson's disease because you don't even know you're at risk. And so people people have been calling us with questions about that, and we're hoping to have those conversations with people who have used the product at any of these points in time in the past, and talk a little bit about what protective equipment they used and things like that as well. I think it's important to add here that paraquat isn't just a Canadian product or a Canadian issue. There are lawsuits in the US and Australia about paraquat neurotoxicity, and paraquat products have also been banned or heavily restricted in 94 countries, including the European Union countries, because they're so dangerous to human health. So this is something that's widely known across the world as being a fairly dangerous product. Before I get into how we're building our case, I think that now that we've talked about paraquat and what it might do, this is a good time to talk about what a class action is, just before I get into the details of how we're building our case and where we are procedurally right now. As I mentioned before, a lot of people have heard of class actions, but not a lot of people necessarily know what to expect when they think they might be a class member in one, or when they think they might know a class member in one. So I'm going to take a minute and talk about what class actions look like. And I'm not going to bore all of you with a law lecture, but I want to give you a general idea. So a class action is a lawsuit where one person or group, called a representative plaintiff, sues a defendant on behalf of a larger group of plaintiffs who are called class members. Class actions are supposed to improve access to justice and save class members and the court resources. So the court saves resources because a class action lets it resolve issues that are the same across many class members all at the same time. And the class members save resources in the sense that the litigation is being guided by the representative plaintiff, who has hired the lawyers to litigate the matter on behalf of the class. So in very broad terms, a class action has three main stages. The first one I'll call certification. The second I'll call prosecution. And the third one I'll call individual claims. At the first stage, which is the certification stage, the lawyers for the plaintiff need to get the court's approval for the lawsuit to be litigated as a class action. So at this stage, the plaintiff's lawyers need to show that the lawsuit is suitable to go forward as a class action because there are common issues that can be resolved using the class action format. These are basically issues or questions. They can be factual issues or legal issues that can be solved across the class. So this stage is called certification in the common law provinces, and it's called authorization in Quebec. In every province, certification / authorization is a pretty resource-intensive process because defendants are usually very well-resourced corporations who don't want to get sued, and they will generally put a lot of effort into trying to fight it. So there's usually a hearing in the court where certification is decided, and there can sometimes be appeals for certification, even though it's not something that decides the whole lawsuit. It just decides whether or not the class action is okay to go as a class action. So the timelines for certification can be pretty long, and not all the stages of the class action are necessarily in the control of one party or the other. If a class action is certified, then it can get into the second stage. So at the second stage, prosecution, there are actually several possibilities for what might happen. If the class action is certified, then the class action can go to trial. But most class actions don't go to trial. A lot of the time, defendants in a class action become a lot more willing to discuss a fair settlement after certification, often because it's already a resource-intensive process. And a lot of evidence might come out pointing in one way or another that will push that along and make it a little bit easier to negotiate a settlement at that stage. So the second stage can result in trial judgment or in a settlement. And then when a class action settles, the settlement always needs to be approved by the court. I'll also say that in class actions, I can't comment necessarily on what this will look like in this particular case, but generally there are quite a lot of rules respecting how class members can be notified about what's going on in a class action. So generally the court will mandate that there be notices released to the public, often through newspapers, often through press releases, that keep class members who are not physically present at the hearing, because there's thousands of them, keeping them up to date about what's going on at all of these important stages. So that is something to keep an eye out for. And my firm always puts updates of this nature onto our website. After those first two stages, there's usually a moving on to the individual claim stage. So if the plaintiffs win a class action, or if there's a settlement, there'll be a court-approved procedure for class members to apply for compensation. So these individual claims processes can look very different depending on the subject matter of the lawsuit and the kinds of claims. This is probably, if you've ever received notices by email directly, or seen class action ads that give you like a little website where you can put in your personal information and some information about your claim, and they'll evaluate it. These processes can look very different from case to case. Sometimes they are very quick and easy with just a form. Sometimes they require medical records or other kinds of documentation. So I can't really give you much of a picture of what that would look like here, since we're not at that stage yet. We don't have a court-approved settlement. We don't have a court-approved process for individual claims at this stage, but that is something to look out for. So I hope that gives you just a general picture of what to expect from a class action and what the different stages are, and sort of what that term means, and what the role of class members versus the council are. We're of course always happy to answer these types of general questions as the case proceeds. As I mentioned, our case right now is still in its very early stages, so most of this hasn't happened yet. We're still we're still in just before the first stage, really, for the lawsuits. So that actually brings us to where we are in the cases right now. So my firm, Siskinds, and our affiliated law firm in Quebec have filed class actions in Ontario, BC, and Quebec on this issue. We filed the class action in Quebec first, and in April 2021. So it's the furthest along right now. At this point, we filed all of our authorization materials in Quebec, and we're actually just waiting for the responding documents from the defendants right now. So we're expecting something from them in the coming weeks, but they need time to review what we've sent them. So we're taking this time to keep building our case for later down the line. All the class actions revolve around the same core allegations, which are the allegations I've discussed earlier. And right now, we're building a case to mainly support our claim that the defendants knew or should have known about the risk that paraquat would cause Parkinson's disease, and then failed to properly warn consumers about the risk, that they designed and marketed a product that was dangerous for the use they marketed it for, didn't tell people, and people suffered damages as a result. We're alleging that the defendants were negligent because they failed to properly design and test the product to ensure that it would be reasonably safe for those kinds of uses as well. So a key point here is that class members, could not have known how risky the products were when they bought them, and that they were exposed to gramoxone or other products containing paraquat and developed Parkinson's disease as a result, in spite of the defendant's knowledge about the risks and their obligations to say something about it. And as I said, none of these things have been proven in court yet. I'm just describing the allegations that we're making. So yeah, that's a big part of the story we want to tell about paraquat when we get to that stage. And that kind of brings us to how we're building our case right now. So a large part of our evidence, as I mentioned, is going to be based on scientific studies, and not just the scientific studies alone, but also on expert analysis, expert reports from scientists who have the kind of relevant knowledge and experience to give a reliable opinion on what conclusions the court can draw from the large amount of research out there that has been out there since the 1980s, even earlier, the 1970s, about the features of paraquat, how it's toxic, how it behaves in the body, what impact it has in the animal studies, what impact it has in the epidemiological studies, and can tell us, these are the conclusions you can draw from this. Another important part of the case is obviously what the defendants knew at various points in time, which is something else we're collecting information on. And then the other important part of the case is that we want to tell the stories of the people who contact us, who are actually affected by this, the misconduct we're alleging. So the science and the expert reporting can paint us a picture of how paraquat could get into the brain and cause Parkinson's disease. But the other side of the picture is how it actually did that and what that did to people in the community. So that's why we are so keen to have these types of public conversations, and why we'd love to talk to people with Parkinson's and their families who want to learn more about the case and their rights. So I think that's about it. That's about all I'd like to cover right now. And I'll also send around an information sheet to Devin. And as I said, I know our contact information is up on the PSSO website. And I can put our frontline person's email address in the Zoom chat if that helps. But other than that, I think that just about concludes my presentation. So I'd be happy to open the floor to questions at this point.
Fantastic, thank you. So I just want to remind everybody for the question, we don't have to have a super structured nature to this. If you want to just wave at me, I'll kind of monitor the screen. If you don't have your camera on, there's a virtual raise hand feature as well too. You could feel free to use that if you know how to do that. And then yeah, we just do everything kind of orderly. I have received a question in the chat, and I have some questions of my own. So I'll save those. If anybody wants to unmute or kind of start with questions, please feel free to do so. And sometimes silence is the best motivator. So I'll sit here for 10 seconds and we'll see how. Ken's got one already. Okay, we'll start with you, Ken. Go ahead.
Great. Hi, Ellen. Thanks for that information.
Hi, Ken.
I had a farm from 1972 to 1979, and then I managed the Campbell Soup poultry farms from 1979 to 1992. I know that on my own farm, I use products like RoundUp, atrazine, 2,4-D. I do not recall using something called Paraquat. But I'm just wondering, what do any of those others that I mentioned overlap? Are they another name for the same thing? That's my question.
Okay, thank you so much for asking that, Ken. I really appreciate your asking that question, because that's a question people call up our law firm all the time with, and something that we have to answer a couple of times a week for people, because yeah, as it turns out, RoundUp is a different product. Atrazine and 2,4-D are also different chemicals with different composition. Those chemicals are not part of the lawsuit that we are doing right now. So if you do feel that you have questions about those products and the impacts of them on your health, unfortunately, we might not be the right people to call for that. But if you do find out that you have used Paraquat or Gramoxone at any point, that would fall within our purview. One thing we do have that we have been sending out to people is an information sheet, which basically contains a lot of the different brand names under which Paraquat products have been sold. So if you would like to reach out, we'd be happy to send you our information sheet that kind of describes the product. It has photographs of the packaging as well for different brands that might be helpful as a memory aid in case it is something that you've seen, but it sounds like you were mentioning to me that wasn't what you ended up using. But I think for anyone else who has that question, because it is a question we get a lot, particularly about RoundUp, because I think RoundUp has also been in the news a lot as like a commercial pesticide that has been associated with some very toxic health effects. You know, people wonder, like, if you're doing this one, why not the other one? That one's not in our wheelhouse or part of this lawsuit right now, but never say never, I guess. Yeah. So we'd be happy to respond to any inquiries like that, and send along the materials we have to anyone who might not remember what they used or who might not be sure.
Well, it sounds then for sure that I do not qualify, but suppose I had used Paraquat. I keep records and so on longer than most people, I'm sure. I'm quite organized, but I do not have receipts for the ones I did use going back that many years. So how does somebody come along if I had just off the cuff said, oh yeah, I use Paraquat? How do you prove or disprove that?
So at this stage, we're not actually concerned on an individual basis about proving it for every single person who contacts us. Sorry?
I would be sure the chemical company is concerned.
Absolutely. But I think I'm just going to take the conversation back to what I was saying earlier about the structure of class actions. So I think part of the issue of individual causation and what's going on with each individual is something that is going to be addressed by the courts at a later stage once we move past the question of certifying the class action and just getting the green light to go ahead. So for now, we're not too concerned for the people who contact us about whether or not they have receipts and what kinds of records they might have. For the people who do contact us and who do retain us on an individual basis to pursue their interests in an eventual individual claims process, we requisition different types of records on their behalf, including medical records. So that is something that we are thinking about on an individual basis, on a case-by-case basis for people who contact us. But ultimately, what records are required to prove each case is going to depend on the outcome of what happens at certification.
Ken, another good way to think about it is obviously having receipts would be the best. I mean, the best would be a film of someone applying paraquat, but obviously no one has that. Receipts would be the best, but when push comes to shove, when we get to that stage, there'll be lots of different ways that we can show that people use paraquat, be that them remembering what they used or notes they have in journals, etc. So that eventually will be an issue. You're right to note that Syngenta will care about this, but that's a thing we have to tackle in all of these cases, and we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, I think an important thing that a lot of people forget is that individual affidavits are evidence. There's a lot of things that can prove what happened or didn't happen in court, but the relative strength of an individual case, that's really going to depend on what happens a little bit later down the line. Yeah, I'll let Devin moderate.
Yeah, I think, Joe, I saw you first there. Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, you mentioned that paraquat gets into the bloodstream. I was wondering how long it can stay in the bloodstream, and is there any way to test for it, like after all these years? Like when I was on the farm, I was
60 years ago.
60 years ago. There's no records or anything like that to prove one way or the other. So is there any way of testing your blood to see if you've got some of those chemicals in your bloodstream? I would think after this time, they're probably mostly gone.
So that's a very good question. One thing that we are doing, as I mentioned, on an individual basis is collecting medical records. In terms of what testing is available, I actually don't have the answer for that for you right today, but that is an important question, and I would like to get back to you on exactly how you might work to figure out whether or not it's still there. The evidence that we have, scientifically speaking, just based on the studies, is that it can stay in the bloodstream for a long period of time. It can accumulate in the brain for a very long period of time. So I'll let Daniel speak to it a bit more.
Yeah, so paraquat is a very interesting chemical in that it doesn't easily break down in the body, but it is cleaned out of the body and out of the blood by kidneys, and that's how it ends up in the urine. So the places that we expect it to linger include in the brain, which to state the obvious, there's not an easy way to test what's in someone's brain, and if there was, you wouldn't want us to do it. So though that said, there's some suggestion that there might be tests for this in the future, but as we understand the science, we kind of come at this from what's called like a differential diagnosis perspective when we're looking at individual class members and their claims. So Joe, if you used paraquat on the farm, and as Eileen indicated, we have this memory aid that we can send over if you get in touch with us that might help you remember, because maybe you don't remember using paraquat, but you remember the shape of the containers or their color or the color of the liquid, what it smells like, those sorts of things. And then scientists and doctors can then say, well, what are the other things that Joe's been exposed to that have been connected to Parkinson's disease? And there's not a very long list. So people get Parkinson's disease from a couple different sources. One of them is there's a small number of people who have extraordinarily bad genetic luck. And when those types of people, they tend to have it, and for example, their father has it, their father's father, and so on. This is a type of genetic issue that means you're almost certainly going to get it. You tend to get it much younger, and so on. There are people who have suffered from pretty severe brain trauma. You think of Muhammad Ali in this context. So if you had a history of being a boxer or that sort of stuff, that might be a thing that could be linked to Parkinson's disease. There are then a series of environmental factors. There's something called atypical Parkinsonianism or manganese poisoning, which is not really Parkinson's disease, but looks a lot like Parkinson's disease. That is associated with people who do a lot of welting. And there are ways we can determine if people have that or if they have Parkinson's disease, in particular, how they respond to various medications. And then after that, there's the environmental factors. So there's paraquat. There's another pesticide called MNTP, which is very rarely used, something called rotenone, which is very rarely used, and so on. So what we've typically ended up doing when we talk about clients that we work with and the experts that we have is we kind of go down this list of stuff. Do they have these genetic predispositions? So you can get genetic testing and so on. Were they welders? Were they boxers? And were they on a farm where they used these products? So that's where we kind of get into these sort of complicated things. And it's a little bit tricky when people are on the farm many, many decades ago and they don't remember real well what they were using. That's fair enough. So we try to do our best detective work, try to figure out what they had exposure to. And I think we recognize that because of the long latency period, because of when a lot of our clients were on the farm or in agricultural settings, it can get hard to get perfect information. But if there were a test, Joe, we would tell you about it.
Thank you.
Anytime.
I see some hands going up, but I just wanted to ask a question while we're in that kind of same vein of thought, because I've got some questions in the chat here that are very similar. So bridging off of Ken's question originally, are you aware of any studies that show paraquat potentially staying in soils for a long period of time, and with that level of exposure, say in water sources or wells, be enough to potentially have the same kind of effects as direct exposures?
Okay, there are two questions there, and I'll take them separately. So with regard to, does paraquat linger in the soil? Paraquat bonds with stuff in the soil very effectively. So with respect to your second answer, I think you'd have to consume and be around an awful lot of that soil for it to matter, or matter to the same extent that if you were applying it or you were crop dusting or you were flagger, et cetera. With regard to how long it stays in the soil, there's some indication that it stays in the soil for quite some time, and using very specific and complex technologies like mass spectrometers and so on. You can kind of look for very, 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 very minute trace amounts of it. I don't know that there's a lot of discussion of that in the science, but there's a little bit of that sort of analysis out there. Does that answer your question, Devin?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. I think was it Brian and Judy had waved their hand before. Do you have a question still, or was that answered? Oh, you're muted still.
Sorry, these are Brian's questions. Go one at a time. You may have covered this. Has there been any studies that show causation or only correlation?
Yeah, I'll let Daniel ask.
Sorry, that's a really good question, Brian. So this is a very fundamental question about the nature of what different type of sciences try to show. So one big family of research about the link between paraquat and Parkinson's disease is something called epidemiology. And epidemiology looks at large groups of people and tries to figure out what's going on with them. And epidemiologists, if you bother them, will tell you that they don't do causation. They just do very, very strong correlations. And if you get a bunch of epidemiologists in a room and you ask them, does smoking cigarettes cause cancer? they'll tell you, yeah, we're pretty sure there's a very strong correlation, but we're not in the business of causation answers. So in terms of human studies, the most frequent way we study humans for these exposures is through epidemiology. The reason for that is it is obviously not ethical to do human trials where we're injecting small amounts of paraquat into people and seeing what happens to them. As Eileen mentioned, we do inject small amounts of paraquat into various animals. Well, not me, but people do inject small amounts of paraquat into various animals and see what that does. And as Eileen indicated, one of the ways that Parkinson's scientists, so the people who are working to cure Parkinson's disease, the way they develop animal models of Parkinson's is they inject paraquat into lab rats and so on, because that causes these sorts of outcomes. So when we look at the overall scientific picture, we look at a mix of these various studies and we say, well, we have a strong link in the epidemiology. And there's a lot of recent studies we can talk about if you're interested that show us this correlation. We have a mechanism of action we see in the animal studies that gives us this causation in the animal world. And then we have exposure studies, and Eileen mentioned these studies from the 80s that show that when people are spraying this in the field, it ends up in their urine, which means it was in their blood. So we take these things together, and we think that paints a compelling picture that this link exists. There's a lot more science out there. Certainly, if you had someone here who worked for Syngenta, they would talk to you about different studies and what they think those studies say. We don't think those studies are very good studies, but that's for them to show and us to fight about. So does that answer your question, Brian? All righty. Sorry to interrupt, Eileen.
Thank you.
Oh, not at all. That's more or less what I was going to say as well. Sorry, did you have other questions?
Yes, but we'll let somebody else go next.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Suzanne, I saw your hand next.
I think it's been addressed to a degree. What I was wondering about was the water table and shallow wells on the farms that I've had. That is at one farm, the well was over 200 feet deep. The other one, the well was only 12 to 15 feet deep, if I can remember correctly.
Right.
So I was wondering about that exposure through the water table.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the short answer is it'll depend on a lot of different things, Suzanne. So if the farm in question was a farm where paraquat was used very heavily, but you, for example, never did the application, but you were drinking a shallow well water, like I think we would want to, if you're interested, spend a little bit more time with you exploring what those circumstances were. Eileen already said this, but I'll just repeat it. There's kind of a continuum of exposures to paraquat. So on the most severe end, there are people called flaggers. And in the old days, they would stand in a field waving a flag over their head. Crop dusters would dump chemicals on the field with them in it. Those people had extreme exposure to paraquat. And the science we've seen shows that those people develop Parkinson's relatively quickly. On the other far end, someone who walked beside a field once that had paraquat sprayed on it the day before, they might have certainly potentially some slight exposure, but the science that we're aware of suggests that more exposure than that is necessary to draw the sort of correlative and causative links we're looking to draw. And then the real world happens in between those two poles, Suzanne. So the short answer, and I know lawyers say this all the time and non-lawyers hate hearing it, is it depends. I'm sure doctors say something pretty similar, but Devin can defend himself. So if you want to talk a little bit more about that, I think we can either have or can drop into the chat our contact information. I'll just drop that in a second. And then you can feel free to reach out to us and ask any questions, and we can have this conversation kind of offline. Oh, there you go. So that's the phone number you can call, and the email if the person who's kind of corralling the information. If you get in touch with Donna, she'll put you in touch with Eileen or Tyler or myself or someone else on our team.
Okay, good. Thanks.
George, go ahead.
Hi, you just mentioned about the difference between somebody walking through the field and somebody standing in the field with the crop plane going over top.
Yeah.
Well, when you're children and you're messing about in the field for 10 years, though your absorption rate is going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't remember because you're children, you're just doing what your parents have told you to do, and you don't know, like, I know we'd have to obviously have more communications besides this one to determine if that volume of product that might have been or might not have been inhaled or absorbed through the skin could cause it. I understand that. So what happens if something happens in our life that we're not here after you get certification, and we'll never know if the absorption that we might have had, but we're not here to tell you about it? Does that have to get done through the autopsy and the records are kept?
Oh, that's a great question, George. So the short version is the easiest thing for us to do is to collect information from people while they are alive and capable of pass that information on. And I know everyone here is dealing with Parkinson's in some way, shape, or form. And I know from my own family experience that there are points in time in the progression of the disease where that becomes much more challenging. So, if people get in touch with us now, we can ask them sort of these questions before we are in a situation where someone's passed on and their estate is making a claim. And then, of course, as you've indicated, it becomes much more tricky to figure out when someone is exposed and how. For your exact fact scenarios, like someone in the fields when they were a child, it'll depend. If someone was having a catch in a field, moments after it was sprayed, that's, in our understanding of the science, very different than if they were in the field days later or weeks later.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Yeah, so those are the sorts of questions we're eager to ask people and find out more from. I mean, we understand, in this case, like many cases, class members, all sorts of things happen, and the easiest way for us to make sure we have people's information is to be in contact with folks and get their information in a time frame when they're able to give it to us in a way that's convenient.
Because this piece of paper that was completed is if you were an employee, not a child. It was labor, but it was it was family labor, so it's not, you're not considered an employee.
Yes, so we're always, I mean, if we, as I think you've indicated, we send out like a standard questionnaire to kind of get information from folks, and if you indicate kind of unique circumstances, Tyler and Eileen and I would kind of chat about that, and we'll reach out and try to get more information from you. And the short answer for all of this stuff, George, is it depends. There's, as we've indicated, is a continuum of exposures that we think are consistent with the science, and we're trying to figure out, or the science as we understand it today, and we're trying to figure out how to peg people on that continuum with regard to the liability picture we're trying to paint in this lawsuit.
Okay, thank you.
Anytime.
Shelley, you got a question there?
Yeah, I just, with regards to how gathering the information that Daniel was just talking about, is there any connection between our medical professionals that obviously are, have dealt with some of our clients for years? Is there any connection to, speaking with them and knowing, having them get in touch with clients that may be very relative to this case over the years that they have known? I'm just wondering, obviously things like this bring it to the forefront. So, and the number of people here today and the information that we're getting out, but I'm just wondering, is there any connection between, those medical professionals letting you know people that, may be very important and may be instrumental in this case?
So I can answer that one. We haven't been in touch directly with medical professionals for that purpose at this point. Right now, we have been having conversations directly with people that have either contacted us or that we've been put in touch with. I think this is the first of our broader community meetings where we've been able to interface with a large number of people we know are connected in some way to the Parkinson's societies. So our communications have been with people who think that they might be class members or think they might know class members. And then for those who choose to retain us, we've been requesting medical records on their behalf, obviously with their consent, so that we can make sure that that's all above board. But we haven't spoken to doctors yet. That's something for our team to discuss, I guess.
I think Brian and Judy again. Oh, make sure you're unmuted there.
Sorry.
Perfect.
Do you have any knowledge of it having been used in apple orchards? And would there be a difference if it's used 12 months a year as opposed to 2 months every year?
Yeah, we have been in contact with people who have reported its use in apple orchards, and we do have some evidence and reports to that effect as well. As to the difference between 12 months and 2 months a year, I think that's very relevant to what my colleague Daniel had said earlier, where it's really a question of what was going on in the specific case. If someone was in the field applying it every day, 12 months a year, that sounds like a very different level of exposure than someone applying it 2 months a year. But it also depends on the number of years and the product and the protective equipment used. So that is something to think about on a case-by-case basis. But certainly if you know someone who's applied paraquat in an apple orchard 12 months a year for several years, that's someone we'd be interested in talking to for sure. I'm not sure if my colleague Tyler had something to add.
No, I was going to say essentially what Eileen had said. And one thing I would perhaps add is that I know we were talking about sort of the evidentiary requirements and things of that nature earlier. As we've sort of been talking to people and thinking about the case and gathering their stories, we have developed or we have kind of amassed quite a bit of information on the types of applications that were most common. And I know Eileen talked a bit about that earlier, but one thing we know is that when we hear information about farming, and especially if we know the area, there's sometimes sort of circumstantial things that we can kind of put together and provide a bit more certainty that it was paraquat being used. But we certainly do have information from people who apply paraquat in orchards.
What I was wondering about when I asked through Judy, 12 months or 2, there's chronic use of something, and there is something that you might call intermittent chronic use. My personal example is that for about 30 years, from the age of 20 to 50, my former in-laws were apple growers. And again, I don't know if they use paraquat. My former partner graciously declined to get an answer for me for fear of lawyers coming on to farmers. That was the reason. But for about 30 years, I would go out to the farm in season and work with other relatives during pick your own season. So I'd be out there weekends from late August till the end of the season. And that went on for most of those 30 years. That was my example.
Yeah, I think thank you for sharing those details with us. I think that that sounds like the sort of exposure we would imagine could come within the lawsuit if Paraquat was used. I don't think I can comment much more on your individual circumstances with what you've given me, but if you haven't contacted us yet, I would suggest that you think about it, so we can take a closer look and see if we can provide a better, more fulsome answer for you that way. Tyler, sorry.
Oh, so just one thing I was going to add, Brian, is that you know, you mentioned about sort of farmers being targeted, and the way we sort of envision things and the way we framed our claim is that I think we recognize that the farmers are the people who are often victims of this kind of thing. And so the targets of the lawsuits and the defendants of the lawsuits are the companies that produce the chemicals that Eileen named earlier, and that's Syngenta and some related companies. And so, you know, we have many clients who are farmers, and farmers are not sort of the people that we're targeting here.
It could be in a cross-filing, Syngenta taking on farmers, etc., who have been mentioned by you in the first lawsuit.
Yeah, that's a thing that defendants sometimes threaten to do. I've not seen it in most of our cases, and I think it would be challenging to do here. And we can certainly talk about that in a little bit more detail, Brian. And to give you some indication of, you know, days of application and so on, you know, the epidemiological studies, and I'm thinking here of the Tanner 2011 study in particular, you know, talk about exposures in people above and below the median number of days of exposure. So, you know, the number of days that people that the median number of days of exposure in the Tanner group is about 8 days of exposure. And we see, you know, more severe odds or higher odds ratio above that number of days. So, you know, certainly year-round application is a fairly heavy amount of exposure to paraquat, as we understand the science. So, you know, that's a sort of thing that I think we could talk a bit more about.
Great. Len, I see that you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question? No question. Okay. I have a question that I received here in the chat. But I was going to say, we know that Parkinson's develops over a long period of time, and we've talked at length about kind of the continual exposure to paraquat. But would you qualify for the class if you were heavily exposed to paraquat, but you haven't yet reached that threshold for a diagnosis of Parkinson's yet?
That is, sorry, go ahead, Eileen.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say that's a good and complicated question. The short version is that is maybe, and it will depend exactly on you know, what happens as the lawsuit progresses. I would say your best outcome is not to get Parkinson's disease, obviously. So you know, I think everyone should hope for that sort of outcome. But you know, the science that we're aware of shows, you know, latency periods in the, you know, decade plus sort of numbers. So we see odds ratios increasing above, say, 10 or 15. Sorry, odds ratios are a thing we talk about in epidemiology. That is the odds of an event happening in one group compared to average. So an odds ratio of 2 means people in the non-control group, the treatment group, have twice the chance of the thing we're interested in happening than normal. So we see odds ratios go up, as we get beyond 15 years and so on. So, if you were heavily exposed to paraquat and you're concerned that you are getting closer to a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, maybe you notice some of the early symptoms and you're working with a neurologist and they're just trying to sort out, what exactly is happening. It is our job to talk to you about this. So by all means, get in touch, and we will, we'll be able to kind of be there as more is discovered. I mean, I think everyone on this call knows better than I do that, there's not blood test for Parkinson's. Like, you don't go into a doctor's office and they put a swab down your throat, like, yep, you have Parkinson's. It's a complicated thing. They look at, obviously, certain symptoms that people are experiencing, how they respond to medication, and so on. But if you are engaging with a movement disorder specialist or a neurologist and you have a history of Parkinson's use, by all means, get in touch with us. And maybe you're lucky and nothing's wrong with you, in which case, you've not wasted anybody's time. We're happy to have the conversation. And if you are unlucky and you are diagnosed with PD, then we're obviously happy to have that conversation then.
Thank you. Brian and Judy.
You mentioned farmers. I just wondered, has there been any contact or connection with greenkeepers at golf courses?
Yeah, so we use farmers because it's the most common use of paraquat. So paraquat was used in a number of commercial settings. So it was used on farms, orchards, greenskeepers, clearing brush around infrastructure and so on. There's not a lot of residential use of paraquat in Canada. There was a little bit, there's some advertising of it kind of decades back, but this isn't the sort of thing that, someone who grows, I don't know, roses or whatever would have been using. But you're certainly right, ma'am, that, greenskeepers, people clearing brush near infrastructure, farmers, people working in orchards, those sorts of environments would use it. Paraquat is a very, very good, in the sense that it's effective tool in the agricultural portfolio. It is also, it smells terrible. It's extremely dangerous from its acute ingestion. Eileen talked about this, that if you drink it, you will die very quickly. So it's not the sort of thing that people, we're just kind of picking up at home hardware and applying. So it tends to be people who are using this in sort of commercial type settings. That definitely includes greenskeepers, some greenskeepers, not all. People use lots of different chemicals to control golf courses. This was one of them.
Thank you.
Dorothy, you got a question? Go ahead.
Yes, what I'd like to know is, has this class action suit been certified yet, or is it still, are you still in the stage of?
No, that's a good question, and so we aren't at the we haven't had the certification hearing yet. As I mentioned, we are just awaiting for the defendants to respond to our materials in Quebec. For that hearing, so we're waiting on them. We're expecting a response in the coming weeks, and then after that, we will set about gathering more evidence and working our way towards a hearing.
Okay. And I remember hearing a doctor say something about well water, and I've heard somebody say this morning or this afternoon that there was a water table sort of thing. And I know two people that have had Parkinson's that live very close to each other in a farming setting. And I live nearby. And I don't know, the one person is dead now, so the other person is still alive, and so am I, but I don't know whether there'll be any connection there or not. I don't know whether anybody used paraquat or anything like that.
Yeah, so the science, when scientists talk about causes of Parkinson's disease, in the category of environmental causes, well water is one of the things that's listed. And our understanding of the science is that's just a proxy for the other environmental causes, which is to say there's nothing, the H2O in well water is the same H2O in city water, the same H2O in fancy bubbly water from France. It's the other stuff that's in there, and that's just a proxy for other environmental contaminants that may have been sprayed on those farms. So if you know, if there's a bunch of people in your community that are suffering from Parkinson's disease, you know, we can certainly talk to you, Dorothy, and kind of see if we can talk to these other people and figure out if anybody was using paraquat or so on. I mean, I know I said it several times, but everyone's case is a little bit different. So if you get in touch with us, we're happy to talk it through.
I had another question in the chat here that I think I could try to answer myself. So there, the question relates to the LD50, or the lethal dose for half the exposed, which is a measure we use to see the toxicity of certain chemicals or substances. So the question is looking at if there's an equivalency. So of course, this would be something they could test in mice, and what the equivalent dose might be for human ingestion. So I don't know if we would know that specifically. That might be more of an acute response rather than the kind of accumulative response here.
Kind of talk this through. It's complicated. Okay, so when we often talk about the toxicity of paraquat, we are often talking about its acute toxicity. So this is what Eileen mentioned, which is even a capful swallowed will kill you. There was a period of time when paraquat was unfortunately one of the most commonly used methods of suicide and occasionally murder in farming communities because it's extremely toxic and there is no antidote. A lot of the analysis around LD50 is tied up in the acute toxicity of paraquat, which is different than what we're interested in here. So if you swallowed a cup of paraquat, maybe you would develop Parkinson's in 5 years, but you would be dead in 5 minutes, so it doesn't much matter. So there are very few chronic exposure studies in mice regarding what a safe dosage of paraquat would be. And part of the reason for that is what Eileen talked about on the science front, which is that paraquat is what's called a redox cycler. And what this means is even a very small amount of paraquat, when it enters the brain, has the capacity to create a very long chain of oxidation and reactive oxygen species and so on, which can cause a sort of oxygenated stress and thus lead to these symptoms. So a lot of the typical analysis that toxicologists are interested in, which is called like dose response levels, i.e. this very famous toxicological principle that the dose makes the poison, doesn't translate very cleanly into these sorts of redox cyclers, at least as we understand the science today. So there's a lot of analysis out there about exactly how much paraquat you can ingest before you die, but that is almost always in the context of acute paraquat ingestion. And to state the obvious, you don't want to try this out. Like, it's very, very bad. You should not drink it. But the chronic exposure studies don't tend to try to answer that question, in part because mice don't live that long, and in part because it's very clear we can cause Parkinson's disease in mice and rats by exposing the paraquat, because, as Devin may or may not be able to tell you from his own experience, if he's done this sort of research, when doctors and PhDs want to study Parkinson's in animals models, this is exactly what they do. There's a protocol. You inject rats with paraquat, and then you give them a certain amount of a certain number of days, and then they develop the hallmarks of Parkinson's disease, the motor symptoms, and so on. And then, you know, when you get into their brains, they have Lewy bodies and all this sort of stuff. So that's a great question about LD50s, but it's really about acute toxicology, and not so much about the chronic issues we're dealing with here. But it's a really good question, very detailed question. Thank you.
Brian, go ahead.
Some of you might be able to help me with my memory. I have a vague memory of early study of Parkinson's, that there was a village or area in Italy, I believe, that had a high rate of Parkinson's in the area. If anybody can confirm the knowledge of that information, my question would be, have you looked at that to see if that was, I suspect, farmland of some kind, and whether paraquat was used in that area?
Yeah, I don't know the Italian study you're talking about. We can certainly take a look at that. I think the best epidemiological study, Brian, it comes out of two studies. There's a huge cohort study called the Farming and Movement Evaluation, or FAME study, which is part of the Agricultural Health Study, which is a study that tracked just shy of 85,000 pesticide applicators in North Carolina and Iowa. So this is a very, very large study that tracked for many years these 85,000 people and kind of saw what happened with them. And the reason that they were interested in those particular states was about the quality of the records and people's understanding of what pesticides they've been exposed to. And that study became part of this paper called Tanner 2011. It's called Rotenone, Paraquat, Parkinson's Disease by Carolyn Tanner and I don't know, a dozen other scientists. And that was a large analysis that performed the sort of epidemiological work around these people, their exposure to various chemicals, and Parkinson's disease as an endpoint. There are other studies done other places. I think there's a series of studies out of Singapore, and there's a series of exposure studies done in France, various French colonies, and there's at least one done in Spain. But I don't know, at least off the top of my head, an Italian study, but we can certainly try to find it. Thank you. That's very helpful.
I could be wrong. That's why I was wondering if anybody else remembered that.
Yeah, I mean, the science on this is evolving very quickly. So Parkinson's disease is an area of a lot of research and a lot of scientific analysis. And there's been a lot of recent developments in terms of what we understand in terms of the genetics and environmental factors and so on. So and I've had in my side chat with our team, Tyler is mentioning this Italian analysis that I think was perhaps looking at genetic issues in a small Italian community. And of course, there are certain genetic conditions that cause paraquat very quickly and immediately. So there's a lot of genetic testing that can be done around paraquat. It's basically divided into two broad categories. There are certain genetic markers that, like the LRRK2 gene and so on, that make it more likely that a person will develop Parkinson's when exposed to environmental things. And then aside from that, there's a small number of genetic causes that are called autosomal dominant causes. And these are things that if you just lose the genetic lottery and have this gene, you're getting Parkinson's. There's nothing much to do about it. And those sorts of genes travel in families. So you'll see case reports in the science, Brian, of people, they have Parkinson's, their mother, their father had Parkinson's, their mother, their father had Parkinson's, and so on. Those people tend to develop Parkinson's more young than people with environmental exposures. And they have this family history that is often striking. So it wouldn't surprise me to learn that in smaller communities, these sorts of genetic issues can cluster. I don't know if Tyler's finished reading the paper as I've been talking, but is that approximately what the Italian paper was about, Tyler?
I think the Italian study was focused on the sort of genetic link and sort of discovering the way the PD can be inherited, and so it's not it's not specifically what this lawsuit is focusing on.
Thanks, Tyler.
I have a question that just came in the chat. It just says about farming. So what kind of crops would it have been used with?
Oh, it has been used in a very, very wide array of crops. So many different types of fruit orchards, nuts, vegetables, like pasture land, plantation type crops. it is an extremely broadly used herbicide that has been used in a lot of different types of farming applications over the years. It was also at some point in time, at least in the United States, used to like desiccate plants before harvest. So there are quite an array of applications. It's hard to, if the question is more along the lines of I worked with plant X, like would this have been what we used? I don't know if we can answer it backwards that way. I think we'd have to know what the product was they were using.
There are certain pesticides that are used almost entirely, for example, with like rapeseed or various particular fruits or vegetables or crops. Paraquat's not one of them. Paraquat's ability to disrupt cellular function is true of all living things. I mean, many people have never worked with Paraquat, but if you've worked with Paraquat and you spray it on a plant and it's a sunny day, you can sit down in a lawn chair and watch in 15 minutes it shrivel up and die. So it's that sort of broad-based power that made it so useful in agricultural settings, and it's that and the exact scientific thing that's causing that, this redox cycling, this oxidative stress that exists in the plant sphere, also functions according to the science that we're following in human brains and so on.
Well, I had two hands raised. I think Joe was first, so we'll go to Joe and then Jerry after.
Oh, you're on mute. I think you're still on mute there.
Okay, finally. Sorry about that.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Just wondering if there has been any link with something called essential tremor and paraquat.
Because it's quite often confused.
It's quite often confused with Parkinson's because some of the symptoms are similar. And I have 3 or 4 cousins who have essential tremor, and I think I have a little bit of both, essential tremor and Parkinson's.
I don't, not that I'm aware of, Joe. We can certainly talk to our experts and see, but I've not seen that link identified in the science that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just means that I don't know about it. I don't know if Eileen or Tyler remember something different from the studies.
I think in the Tanner study, there's a brief mention that the people that they surveyed, some of them had PD, some of them had essential tremor. I don't believe there was any conclusion on that with respect to the association.
Right.
I can't give you a definitive answer on that today, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question. Let us noodle it about a little bit. If you get in touch with us, we'll try to think that through. I mean, Parkinson's doesn't just Paraquat doesn't just cause or mimic the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. So, Paraquat is also implicated in the formation of these Lewy bodies, which are these misfolded clumps of this particular protein that's found in neurons, which is one of the hallmarks of Parkinson's disease, and so on. But there are also, as you all know, there are a lot of things that present like Parkinson's in some respects. So I kind of mentioned manganese poisoning, which is this thing that welders can develop. They work with manganese, and it looks an awful lot like Parkinson's. The major distinguishing feature is it doesn't respond to the medications that are helpful with regard to Parkinson's, and that's one of the ways people determine if a welder has Parkinson's or what's called atypical Parkinsonianism, or this sort of manganese poisoning. So, one of the difficulties, I know this was true with my grandfather, was, you start developing these symptoms and you're not quite sure what it is for a while until your neurologist works with you and and it helps get to the bottom of it. Joe, did you have a second question, or do I misremember?
No, that was it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, so next up is Jerry then. Go ahead. I think Jerry was rolling away.
Oh, Jerry just showed up in Suzanne's video.
Oh,
This is a twist. I didn't know this was going to
okay.
happen.
Oh. We'll
All right.
provide a little excitement for you all.
Yeah. It's like Hollywood Squares. Just got excited. All right.
Hi, Jerry.
Yes. Earlier mentioned, Eileen mentioned that you had a sheet of information regarding the packaging and so on of the various brand names and so on. Could that be posted maybe on the website for Parkinson's?
If you email us, we'll get you a copy. We're a little reticent to post it just because it's important to us to be able to use it to jog people's memories. So if you send us an email, we can flip you a copy for you to have a look at, Jerry.
Okay, well, maybe we could get a copy of that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think we put our email contact information in the chat, so you can just email us, or if you reach out to Devin, he knows how to find us.
Yeah.
Right.
Call us too. Call, email, you can mail us a letter if you like. So that's a little antiquated.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll disappear.
Brian.
Do you have a timeline prediction for your work? And if so, what was your start date? And how many clients have you got in the class action at this point?
So that's a good set of questions. We don't have a prediction for how long this is going to take. And I can tell you that the range of time can be very quick, which is unlikely, to a very long time, which is more likely. A lot of what will take time, much time will take will depend on what the defendants do and how they choose to defend the action. If they want to try to stall things and make it go more slowly, that could slow things down. Litigation is never quick, and class actions are especially never quick. So I'm not going to give you a prediction, and you should not infer from that I think it's going to be fast, because I think the opposite. With regard to how many people have contacted us, I don't think we're at liberty to share that. I can say that we've had a lot of contact from people, and as you can imagine, it takes a while for people to fill out our questionnaires and us to kind of figure out what information we need on their case. So there's a disconnect between people contacting us and then kind of working their way through our intake process. And I think you asked about the start date. So the first of these cases was filed in the United States maybe 5 years ago. And our case was filed, I think, 18 months ago or a year ago, something like that. We know the American lawyers quite well, and they've been in touch with our Quebec firm. So that has been kind of the genesis of how the Canadian case got started.
I hope my last comment is this. If I were Daniel's supervisor, I would be giving him an A for his knowledge of Parkinson's. Thank you, Daniel. And also to Eileen and Tyler.
I mean, I can tell you that one of the interesting things about being a litigator is you have to learn different fields when you get involved in different sort of cases. So Eileen, Tyler, and I do class actions for a living, but we do a variety of different types of class actions. Some of them are medical cases. Some of them are about engineering problems. Tyler once did a case involving truckers in Poland. So you learn a lot of different things in this job. But one of the big things that we have to do when we start a case is learn all of this very quickly. And we're blessed to have really good experts who can help educate us. And you know what doctors are like, Brian. They just dump like 200 studies on you and expect you to read them all. And then we all went to law school because we have impulse control problems, so we read them all. And that's how you end up with this. But thank you for the compliment.
And the question that came in the chat here, it says, why has the medical profession not done more to establish the causes of PD so it can be prevented?
I think that the medical profession is trying really hard to establish the causes of PD. And the challenge for medicine about people is it's very hard to do studies. You know, and I wasn't joking when I said earlier, if you ask epidemiologists if cigarettes cause lung cancer, like they're not going to give you a straight answer. And we don't, you know, just to take that, it's a great example. This is, you know, everyone knows that cigarettes cause lung cancer. That was debated in the science for a very long time. And even today, you can't just take people and make them smoke and watch what they do, because you'll get in a lot of trouble, and that's unethical. So I think scientists are trying very hard on Parkinson's and other diseases. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think there's a lot of research being done either by the Parkinson's Society funded doctors, or the Michael J. Fox Foundation funded researchers in the States. So there's a lot of money that's trying to figure out these links. And then, you know, Parkinson's is a disease that affects a lot of people in a lot of different families. So a lot of people, it's quite personal. But I mean, Devin, you're a medical doctor, right? Not a PhD, or are you both?
Medical student, not full doctor yet.
Yeah, well, there you go. But so there are certainly medical doctors, neurologists who work on the treatment side, and there are researchers who work on the treatment side. And I think like diseases of neurological diseases are very complicated, and environmental diseases are very complicated. I mean, just to kind of link this back to lawsuits, which is what the three of us know a lot about, there are very few diseases that are caused by one thing and one thing only. Like the quintessential example of that is there's something called asbestosis, which is caused by asbestos. And there aren't a lot of other examples. Even lung cancer and smoking, there are people who smoke a pack a day their whole life and never get lung cancer. There are people that never smoke that do. So people are working real hard on Parkinson's. And I mean, that's no comfort to someone who's in a family that's affected by Parkinson's disease, because, you know, you think litigation is slow, you should talk to researchers. But it doesn't mean that I think people are trying really hard. And I know the Parkinson's Society of Canada spends a huge amount of time and money on research and research support, which is obviously very important. I hope that answered that question. The answer is people are trying very hard, is the short answer, yeah.
Any other questions? Anybody want to wave at me? What do we think? These have been fantastic questions, by the way. And I think questions and answers, this has been very engaging. I've been awesome.
I mean, we really appreciate talking to all y'all. And if you have any other questions, feel free to call us or email or reach out to Devin or any of the PSSO staff on the call. I'm sure they'd be happy to forward anything on that you have to us. And all I can tell you is we're working hard on this case, and we're hopeful that the case will develop the way we want it to, and we'll be able to get to a good result. You know, it'll not surprise you to know that Syngenta has hired very good lawyers to fight about this, and I'm sure it will be a very interesting problem for lawyers, and that doesn't make it any better for clients, but that's the system we have.
Okay.
I just want to echo, like, these were great questions. These were good, detailed questions that reflect a very educated and engaged group, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, I think that was very well spoken. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Again, if anybody has any further questions, you can get in touch with me, PSSO, Mandy, or directly to the team at Siskinds. And then I also do have some of the research papers from Siskinds that have been discussed. So if you want those specifically, get in touch with me. I can send those through as well too. If you want to take a shot at actually looking at the literature itself. But yeah, so for everybody that came today, again, thank you so much. It's been really engaging, and I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody else has for sure. And I just want to thank everyone for that. And of course, to Eileen, Daniel, and Tyler, thank you so much. This is amazing. It's been a really fun opportunity for me, and I'm glad I was able to organize this and bring it together. And for everyone viewing it afterwards as well too. I think we're going to be able to answer a lot of questions and help a lot of people out. So thank you so much. This has been great.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Great. Thank you.
Our
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Take care.
Everyone.